My brothers and sisters, there are moments in life when fear will grip your heart and paralyze your spirit. You're standing on the edge, looking at your future, and it feels like you're about to lose everything. You've heard the call, you've felt the tug, but every fiber of your being is screaming, what if I fail? What if I get hurt? What if I make the wrong move? But hear me when I tell you fear is not a roadblock. It's a launching pad. I want to talk to you today about the power of moving forward when everything in you says stay where you are. I'm talking about trusting the command of God to keep it moving, even when the world around you is shouting stop. In the book of Exodus, the people of Israel were faced with a terrifying moment. They had just been freed from 400 years of bondage, and as they stood on the edge of the Red Sea, they heard the thunderous roar of Pharaoh's army chasing them. The fear was real, and their backs were against the wall. They were trapped between the water and the enemy. But in that moment of utter fear, God spoke, and he said, keep moving. Why? Why did God tell them to move when there was no way forward? Why did he allow them to be caught between their past and their future? The answer is simple, because the miracle was in the movement. And that's the truth I want you to hold on to today. God's glory is in your next step. You've got to keep it moving, even when you don't know how it's going to work out. Because when you move, the God of the impossible starts working behind the scenes, making a way where there seems to be no way. Speaks to the core of what holds us back from experiencing the fullness of God's plan. Fear often arises in moments when we are pushed into uncertainty, when the comfort of familiarity begins to slip away and we face the unknown. It's easy to look at the situation in front of us and believe that fear is a sign that we're not ready or capable. But faith challenges that idea, teaching us that fear doesn't have to be a barrier. Instead, it can be the very thing that drives us closer to God's purpose for our lives. When the Israelites were led out of Egypt, they were stepping into an unfamiliar journey, trusting in a God they had only begun to understand. They had been enslaved for 400 years, and the memories of the God who had once spoken to their ancestors had grown faint. Their connection to the divine had been watered down by generations of captivity. But God in his mercy chose to hear their cry and respond. He raised up Moses, a leader who would guide them out of bondage, despite the fact that Moses himself had his own fears and uncertainties about the task ahead. He wasn't the ideal candidate by human standards. But God was showing that it's not about our qualifications, it's about his call and his faithfulness. When God instructed the Israelites to move forward, despite the encroaching army of Pharaoh behind them and the Red Sea before them, it was a test of their faith. The Israelites could have easily succumbed to fear, questioning why they were brought to this moment. But God had already made a way for them, and their part was simply to trust. When they faced Pharaoh's chariots thundering behind them, they had every reason to be afraid. Fear was a natural response. But God was about to show them that fear, when surrendered to him, would be overcome by his power. In the middle of their fear, Moses delivered the message, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. In the face of danger, they were called to remain still in their trust, but stillness in this moment wasn't inaction. It was an action of faith. It meant standing firm in the knowledge that God was working even when they couldn't see the solution. Moving forward required them to trust God beyond the visible, to step into the unknown with the confidence that he would lead them to victory. This is the same challenge we face in our own lives. Fear will show up in various forms: fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of the future, fear of not being enough. But when we place our trust in God's promises, when we choose faith over fear, we allow God to move in our lives in ways that will surprise us. Faith doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means choosing to act in spite of fear, trusting that God's strength is greater than our weakness. It means stepping forward when all our emotions scream at us to stay put. As we look at the Israelites in this moment of intense fear, we can find a deep reassurance. The same God who led them through the sea, the same God who parted the waters is with us today. When fear tries to paralyze us, we can cling to the truth that God's power is stronger than any obstacle we face. Fear may try to hold us back, but faith will propel us forward into the victories God has prepared for us. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about trusting that God is faithful, even when we cannot see the whole picture. When we let faith take the lead, fear will no longer dictate our steps. Centers on the transformative strength that comes from responding to God's direction, even when the circumstances around us seem daunting. When God speaks, his command carries weight and authority far beyond our human understanding. His word is not merely a suggestion. It is a directive that holds the power to change our lives, to lead us into new seasons, and to help us overcome the impossible. In moments when we feel vulnerable, uncertain, or afraid, it is God's command that becomes the anchor we need to keep moving forward. In the story of the Israelites' escape from Egypt, the situation appeared hopeless. Pharaoh had let them go, but then, suddenly, he changed his mind. With his army in full pursuit, the Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's soldiers and the Red Sea. They were faced with the terrifying prospect of being recaptured, enslaved again, or worse. It was a situation where fear would have paralyzed most people. But it was in that moment of fear that God issued a powerful command: move on. This command was not just about physically taking steps toward freedom. It was a command to trust God beyond the visible, to act in faith even when the path ahead seemed impossible. God didn't tell Moses to hold a meeting to strategize, to form a plan, or to consult others. He simply gave the command to move on, even though the waters of the sea had not yet parted. It was an instruction that called for immediate action and absolute obedience. God was asking the Israelites to step into the unknown, knowing full well that they had no ability to part the waters on their own. It was a test of their trust in his ability to make a way where there seemed to be no way. God's command to move on speaks directly to our own lives. There are moments when we are unsure about the next step, when the obstacles seem insurmountable and the outcome uncertain. In these moments, the power of God's command is not only about what he asks us to do, but about the authority that his words carry. When God speaks, he creates the reality he commands. He doesn't need our help to make it happen. His command to move is a declaration of what he has already set in motion. For the Israelites, this command was a call to action in the face of overwhelming fear. But in following God's command, they were walking not in their own strength, but in the power of the one who was leading them. God was reminding them that he was in control of the situation, and even though they couldn't see how they would get through, his command was enough. Their obedience to that command set the stage for the miraculous God parted the Red Sea, allowing them to pass through on dry ground and escape the threat of Pharaoh's army. What seemed like an impossible situation became the site of one of the most dramatic displays of God's power in history. When we hear God's command, it may not always make sense in the moment. We may feel unprepared, or we may not fully understand why God is asking us to take certain steps. But the power of his command is not in our understanding, it's in the authority of the one who speaks. Just as the Israelites were called to move forward in faith, we are also called to trust God's direction, even when it doesn't make sense. His command is a promise that he will equip us for what he has called us to do. All we need to do is step out in faith, trusting that his word will lead us into the victory he has already prepared for us. Emphasizes how God's timing is a crucial aspect of his plan for our lives. Often we find ourselves frustrated by delays, unsure of why things are taking longer than expected, or why certain opportunities seem to slip away just when we think we are ready for them. It is in these moments that trusting in God's timing becomes not only a lesson, but a key to unlocking the next step in our journey. God's timing may not always align with our own, but it is always perfect. And when we align ourselves with it, we open the door for his purposes to unfold. The Israelites' escape from Egypt serves as a powerful example of how God's timing works. They had been in bondage for hundreds of years, longing for freedom, yet the release came only when the time was right. Even though they cried out for deliverance, God didn't act immediately. There was a period of waiting, a season when it seemed as though God was silent, when the oppression seemed unbearable. But in this waiting, God was preparing them. He was working behind the scenes, orchestrating events, setting things in motion, and raising up Moses to be their deliverer. This wasn't a random set of circumstances. It was a carefully planned divine timing that would ultimately lead to their freedom. When Moses first appeared before Pharaoh, things didn't go as expected. Pharaoh rejected Moses' plea to release the Israelites, and their suffering actually intensified. For the people, this was a painful blow. They had believed that their deliverance was near, only to face an even harsher reality. It would have been easy for them to question whether God had truly heard their cries, to wonder if they would ever be free. Yet God's timing was perfect. The people had to endure the oppression for just the right amount of time before Pharaoh's heart would be hardened further and the miraculous could take place. Had they been released any earlier, they might not have experienced the depth of God's power in the way they did when He parted the Red Sea. God's timing is not about convenience, it is about preparation. For the Israelites, the time of bondage was a season of refining. The challenges they faced were shaping their faith, teaching them to rely on God. When they finally stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in, they were more prepared to see God's deliverance than they would have been had they been freed earlier. God knew that in their desperation, they would finally be able to fully trust Him to make a way where there seemed to be no way. For us, trusting in God's timing requires patience. It requires us to surrender our own plans and timelines and to rest in the confidence that God knows what is best for us. We may not understand why we are going through certain seasons or why our prayers seem to go unanswered for a time. But when we trust in His timing, we recognize that He is working for our good even in the waiting. His delays are not denials. His silence is not absence. He is preparing us for something greater than we can imagine. And when the time is right, He will move in ways that will surpass anything we could have orchestrated on our own. There will be times when we face uncertainty, when we feel like we're stuck in a waiting season, and when it feels like things aren't happening fast enough. In those moments, we are called to remember that God's timing is not dictated by our clock, but by His perfect understanding of what we need and when we need it. As the Israelites learned, the waiting is never wasted. When we trust in God's timing, we open ourselves to the fullness of what He has prepared for us, and we position ourselves to experience His perfect plan in the most powerful ways. Speaks to the powerful contrast between fear and faith and how the two forces interact in our lives when we are confronted with overwhelming circumstances. Fear is a natural human response, one that can often paralyze us and prevent us from moving forward. Yet it is in moments of fear that our faith can be tested and refined. When we are faced with danger or uncertainty, our initial reaction may be to retreat or freeze. But it is in stepping forward in faith that we find the strength to overcome. The Israelites' journey out of Egypt provides a profound example of how fear can threaten to undermine faith. As they fled from Pharaoh's army, they were caught in vulnerable position. Ahead of them was the vast Red Sea, and then behind them was the might of Pharaoh's chariots closing in quickly. This was a situation that could cause anyone to panic. The people were scared. They were not soldiers, and they had no weapons to defend themselves. They had no power, no position, and no ability to fight back. Their fear was real, and it was understandable. Yet it was in this moment of deep fear that God called them to exercise faith. Moses, sensing the fear among the people, reassured them with a powerful statement: do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. This command was not simply an encouragement to remain calm, it was a call to trust in something greater than the immediate circumstances. Fear would tell them to give up, to turn back, to surrender, but faith would tell them to stand firm and wait for God's deliverance. Fear would keep them rooted in panic, while faith would push them forward into the unknown, trusting that God would provide a way out. In moments of fear, faith often feels like a choice rather than a feeling. Faith isn't about denying fear, it's about choosing to trust in God despite the fear. When Moses spoke to the Israelites, he wasn't telling them to ignore their fears, but to face them head on with the assurance that God was with them. His message was clear: stand firm. In the face of what appeared to be an impossible situation, God was calling them to stand their ground, not in their own strength, but in the strength that comes from knowing God is fighting for them. Fear, when not addressed, has the power to shape our actions and decisions. It can cause us to act impulsively, retreat, or give up altogether. But when we choose faith, we acknowledge that the God who has brought us this far will not abandon us. Faith gives us the courage to keep moving forward even when the path is unclear. It strengthens our resolve to continue even when every logical part of us is screaming to stop. The Israelites, though fearful, had to trust that God's plan was greater than the circumstances that surrounded them. When God told Moses to stretch out his staff over the Red Sea, he was calling the Israelites to act in faith, to step into the unknown with the belief that God would make a way where there seemed to be none. The sea was parted and they crossed on dry land, a miracle that would not have happened if they had let fear keep them from moving forward. Faith, then, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to trust in God's promises in the face of fear. The greater the fear, the greater the opportunity for faith to rise. When we confront fear with faith, we are not merely enduring the challenge, we are leaning on the power of God to deliver us, to guide us, and to open doors that we could never have open on our own. Fear will always try to paralyze us, but faith propels us forward, reminding us that we are not facing the giants of life alone. With God on our side, we can face any fear, overcome any obstacle, and aim them forward into the promises He has set before us. Emphasizes the importance of action, especially when facing uncertainty or fear. When the Israelites were at the Red Sea, they were caught between their past and their future. The sea blocked their way forward, and Pharaoh's army was closing in on them from behind. In that moment of intense crisis, God commanded them to move forward. This was not merely a suggestion, it was a divine directive that would lead to the miraculous. The Israelites were given a choice: to stand still in their fear or to move forward in obedience, trusting that God would provide a way. Moving forward, even when there is no visible path, is an act of faith that demonstrates our trust in God's ability to make a way, even when we cannot see it. In life, we often face moments when the way forward seems impossible. We may encounter obstacles, setbacks, or challenges that leave us feeling stuck. The natural response is to hesitate, to pause, to wait for things to change or for the path to clear up before we take any further steps. But God calls us to move forward, even when we can't see the next step. The Israelites didn't have the luxury of knowing what would happen when they stepped into the sea. They had no idea that the waters would part. All they had was God's command to move. And it was in their obedience to that command, their willingness to take that first step, that the miracle occurred. We are often paralyzed by fear of the unknown, by the belief that we need to have everything figured out before we act. But faith requires us to move forward not because we have all the answers, but because we trust in God's provision and His ability to make a way when there seems to be none. The Israelites could have stayed in place, fearing the approaching army and waiting for a clearer sign or a safer moment. But that would have meant missing out on the miracle that awaited them. The power of moving forward lies in the willingness to act even when we are uncertain, to take that first step into the unknown, knowing that God is leading us. When we move forward in faith, we open ourselves to the possibility of miracles. The act of moving is not just about making progress, it's about aligning ourselves with God's will and His plan for our lives. God doesn't always show us the whole picture right away. Sometimes He only reveals the next step. But as we step forward in obedience, we begin to see how He makes a way where we once saw only obstacles. The Israelites could never have known that the Red Sea would part if they had not obeyed God's command to move forward. Likewise, in our lives, God often requires us to take steps of faith before he reveals his plan fully. Moving forward also requires us to leave behind our comfort zones. The Israelites had been in bondage for so long that they were familiar with their suffering, even if they did want to stay there. But to move forward meant leaving behind everything they knew, including the pain and the fear that came with it. Stepping into the unknown can be intimidating, but it is often the very act of leaving what is familiar that positions us for the next season of growth and blessing. When we move forward, we trust that God has already gone before us. The Israelites were not moving blindly, they were moving with the knowledge that God was leading them. In the same way, when we step forward in obedience, we are not taking a risk on our own. We are stepping into a future that is already secured by God's plans. Moving forward may not always be easy, but it is always necessary for progress. In our own lives, the power to move forward comes from knowing that we are not alone, and that God will provide a way even when there seems to be no way. As we take steps in faith, we trust that God will guide us through the challenges and lead us into his promises. Moving forward is not just about overcoming obstacles. It is about embracing the journey that God has prepared for us and being willing to take each step, no matter how uncertain, because we know he is with us every step of the way. Focuses on the concept that God's timing is always perfect, even when it feels like the situation is getting worse or the answer is delayed. For the Israelites, as they stood at the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army rapidly approaching, it must have seemed like they were caught in an impossible situation. They were trapped with no way to escape in sight. They had left everything behind, but now they were facing the very real threat of death at the hands of Pharaoh's soldiers. It was at this very moment of desperation that God chose to act. The timing was not only perfect, but it was also precise, even in the midst of apparent danger and uncertainty. In our lives, we often find ourselves in similar situations where it seems like we have reached the end of our options, the end of our resources, and the end of our ability to do anything. It feels as though we've been abandoned or that God is silent in our crisis, but God is never late, and he is never too early. His timing is always exactly what it needs to be. What may feel like a delay or a period of waiting is often God's way of preparing us for the miracle that is about to happen. When the Israelites were at the Red Sea, God knew exactly when to part the waters. The miracle happened at just the right time when the people's fear was at its peak, and they had nowhere to turn. They had reached the end of their strength and resources, but God had already set the stage for deliverance. The Israelites did not know it at the time, but God had been preparing a way out for them long before they even reached that sea. His timing was intentional, and it was designed to build their faith and to show them that he could be trusted even when the situation appeared hopeless. God's timing can often challenge our understanding because it rarely aligns with our own. We want immediate results, fast solutions, and quick fixes, especially when we're in distress. But God's plan operates on a different level. The wait is not a denial, but a preparation. In the case of the Israelites, the delay in their escape and the fear they experienced were all part of a greater plan. It was in the waiting that they learned to trust, and it was in their moment of greatest fear that God's power was most evident. The delay provided an opportunity for them to experience God's deliverance in a way they never would have if they had not faced such overwhelming odds. Sometimes we find ourselves at the crossroads of faith and fear, wondering why things aren't happening on our timeline. We pray, we wait, and we hope, but it feels as though God is silent or not responding. But just like with the Israelites, God's silence is not absence. His timing is not ours to dictate. And when he does move, his deliverance is always more than we could ever have imagined. The moment the Israelites stepped into the sea, God's intervention was immediate, and the waters parted in a display of divine power. What had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle was transformed into a path of deliverance. And it happened at the precise moment God had planned. For us, the key is to trust in God's timing, even when we don't understand it. We may not see the way forward, and we may feel like we're running out of time. But God's plans are not limited by our understanding of time. His ways are higher, his thoughts are deeper, and his timing is always perfect. The Israelites' deliverance was not just about getting them out of danger, it was about demonstrating to them and to us that God is in control of every situation, even when we cannot see how things will work out. His timing is a testament to his sovereignty and his ability to orchestrate every detail of our lives for our good and his glory. In moments of waiting, we are called to remember that God's timing does not fail, even when our circumstances scream otherwise. Just as the Israelites stood at the Red Sea looking at what seemed to be their end, we too may face seemingly impossible situations. But we can take comfort in knowing that God's deliverance will come at just the right time. When it seems like there is no way forward, that is the moment when God is preparing to act. His perfect timing will always bring us to the place of deliverance, even when we cannot see how it is possible.